There are fascinating stories and complicated people in Norse mythology. It's no surprise that it's become popular again in recent years, thanks to things like Marvel's Thor movies, Neil Gaiman's book and TV show American Gods, and Rick Riordan's Magnus Chase series. Despite their popularity, the original tales remain a mystery, with discussions raging over what specific events represent, who wrote what, and even whether the stories are the same ones the Vikings told. Do you want to learn Norse mythology but need help knowing where to begin? We've got your back. Here's everything you need to know about Norse mythology. Without further ado, let's start. The Norse were ancient people who possessed a complete set of gods. The Norse, who originated in what is now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and of course Iceland, had an almost endless variety of gods and goddesses who oversaw, watched over, and steered events in this small blue world. What is the origin of Norse mythology? The Norse were an ancient people that lived in most of Scandinavia. They were named after their language, Old Norse. Because of the settlements they'd built in England, Old Norse had a significant influence on modern-day English. Most of what we know about the Norse comes from their early writing, especially a group of stories written in Iceland in the 13th century. This collection of stories was known as the sagas, and it's equal parts history and fiction, and in some cases, it's completely insane. They are a romanticized version of what happened to the Norse people as they tried to take over most of Northern Europe. Their ideas originated in paganism and lasted even after Christianity was introduced to most Norse lands. A brief history of the gods. The basic Norse story of how the world was made starts with two worlds on either side of a bottomless abyss called Ginnungagap. This was like the universe before the Big Bang. These two worlds were Niflheim, a land of ice, and Muspelheim, a land of fire. These two worlds became stronger and battled for space throughout time. During the fight, the combination of fire and ice generated water droplets that dropped into the abyss and gave birth to life. The first life was called Ymir, and it was a giant who was equal parts male and female. Other entities made of water droplets eventually overcame and killed Ymir. These entities created the known universes with Ymir's blood, teeth, hair, and bones and became their first gods. The earliest Norse gods represented two distinct households, Aesir and Vanir. Even though they fought a lot, they both knew they had to provide everything needed for life to continue. How many Norse gods and goddesses were there? It is thought that the first Norse tribes worshipped up to 66 separate gods from the time they merged into the Norse until the introduction of Christianity. At least 13 gods among the many they worship are regarded as the most important in Norse civilization. The Norse likewise believed in 9 universes or realms. The one where humanity lived was called Midgard. The one where the gods dwelt was called Asgard, and they were all linked by a mystical tree called Yggdrasil. Let's discover everything about the gods in Norse mythology. Odin. Odin, the Allfather of the Aesir, was the greatest Norse god. He was Asgard's awe-inspiring monarch and most beloved immortal, on an unending quest for knowledge with his 2 ravens, 2 wolves, and the Valkyries. He is the god of war and the deity of poetry and magic, which is deliciously conflicting. He is famous for giving up one of his eyes to see the universe more clearly. He also hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights until he was taught the runic alphabet. Because he wouldn't give up, he was able to solve many of the universe's mysteries. Frigg. Odin's wife, Frigg, was a model of beauty, love, fertility, and fate. She was the mighty queen of Asgard and a respected Norse goddess. She had the power of prophecy, but there was a mystery around her. She was the only goddess permitted to sit next to her husband. Frigg was a protective mother, so she swore a promise to the elements, creatures, weapons, and poisons, not to harm her clever and beloved son Balder. However, Loki, the most treacherous of gods, violated her faith. Balder. Balder's parents are Frigg and Odin, who are said to live between heaven and earth. Balder was the ideal of brilliance, beauty, and fairness. He was considered immortal, but he was killed by mistletoe, the golden bow that held both his life and death. Thor. Thor was Odin's most famous son. He was the god of thunder and the guardian of humanity, wielding the Mjolnir hammer. He was known among the Norse gods for his bravery, strength, healing skills, and righteousness. Freya. Freya was a seductive and passionate goddess in Norse mythology. She was connected with many of the same attributes as Frigg, such as love, fertility, and beauty. She was Freyr's sister. Freyr. Freyr was Freya's twin brother and Njord's son. He was associated with prosperity, fertility, sunshine, good weather, and abundant harvests. Because he represented male fertility and strength, statues of him frequently feature an extra-large phallus. He was a famous god, once considered to be the ancient ancestor of the Swedish royal family. Heimdall. Heimdall was known as the gleaming god. You might think this has something to do with light or sunshine, but it was because he had the whitest skin and gold teeth. Heimdall was so convinced that the end of the world was near that he would spend most of his time sitting on the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge that connected the human world, Midgard, to the kingdom of the gods, Asgard, looking for possible dangers. Hel. Hel was the goddess of the underworld, known as Helheim. Hel was said to have pale skin that made her appear dead. Her job was to look after the souls who had ended up in the underworld. Vidar. Vidar was Odin's son and Thor's half-brother. Odin had a lot of children with a lot of different women. Vidar was considered the second strongest of Odin's children after Thor. Vala. Vala was another of Odin's children and Thor's half-brother. He was born to kill the blind god Hor, who accidentally killed Balder by throwing mistletoe at him after being tricked by Loki. Alva. Alva does not relate to a single god, but to a type of creature that evolved into elves. They resembled humans yet possessed magical abilities. They were often divided into two households in Norse mythology: light elves and dark elves. They weren't seen as complete gods but supernatural entities who could aid or hurt people depending on how they felt that day. Njord. Njord was the Norse wind and sea god. He was in charge of the Vanir, one of the two groups of gods who made the world. He was Freyr's and Freya's father. He was considered the god in charge of protecting fishermen and seafarers. Njord also had the most beautiful feet of all the gods. Sky, a frost giant, was his wife. They met because she was allowed to choose any gods as her husband, but she could only do so by looking at their feet. Is paganism still practiced? Iceland has a fascinating Christian past. They were still practicing pagans until it was decided in 1000 AD that they needed to leave paganism and embrace Christianity. The reason they switched was not so much about belief as it was about trading with their Nordic neighbors instead of considering them as infidels. The most common religion in modern Iceland is Lutheranism. However, there has been a revival of Norse paganism. Satyr is the current name for the Icelandic paganism church. It is the closest Icelanders can get to the Viking religion and the fastest-growing religion in the country. Satyr was given new life in 1973 by a handful of dedicated residents and has since grown. Conclusion. The Norse gods and goddesses have played an important role in Iceland's history. They assisted the early settlers in making sense of the odd and mysterious environment. They could see the beauty in simple things,